Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event, If Roe Goes, More Than Abortion is at Stake, How Fetal Protection Laws Fail to Protect and Even Hurt Pregnant People. I am so excited to have this interdisciplinary panel for you today. And I want to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Wisconsin Doulas of Color Collective, Maroon Calabash, Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin, and the State Bar of Wisconsin Family Law Section. This event has been approved for 1.5 credits for lawyers, CLE credits, Wisconsin CLE credits, social workers, Wisconsin NASW credits, and doulas, your international continuing education credits. I will be announcing codes throughout the program. I can't tell you how many there will be, but I will make it clear when I say one, and you will need to put those codes in your form in order to get credit. So I'm Samantha Lee. I'm a staff attorney at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and we combine legal advocacy, public education, and organizing to work to secure the human and civil rights, health, and welfare of pregnant and parenting people and their families. I come from a family defense background, so I represented parents against child abuse and neglect cases prior to this role, and I'm delighted to be in this broader advocacy role now. So as many of you know, there is a free screening available to you through July 14th, and you can sign up at the link I've provided here and Afsha will provide in the chat. And I think this documentary really provides a great framework for what we're talking about today. So I'm actually just going to play the trailer for you all, and I hope you can tune in to watch the whole movie if you're interested, and if not, this really, I think, frames our issues today.
He has repeatedly referred to pregnant women as hosts.
When I use the term host, it's not meant to degrade women. I actually went and Googled that, and I went to Webster, and I couldn't find a better term.
The so-called personhood bill would give embryos and fetuses all the rights and immunities of other citizens.
An unborn baby would be counted in Colorado's criminal code.
There is no way to add fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses to the Constitution without subtracting pregnant women.
We're separating women from the pregnancies that they have as if we're just the shell that holds the baby.
Your Honor, we are requesting temporary physical custody of the unborn child.
The 14-week-old fetus had a lawyer, where Tammy, who had asked for a lawyer, did not have one and was denied one.
I am hoping other people can hear what's going on because it's so outrageous what they're doing to me. I'm screaming. I'm like, I'm being threatened. I'm pregnant. I'm being threatened to be tased. I'm screaming at the top of my lungs.
It isn't just about abortion. It isn't just about reproductive rights. It's about whether or not, upon becoming pregnant, women lose their personhood.
We are trying to get the law overturned so that this doesn't have to happen to anybody else.
It's about power. This is about misogyny. This is about men not being able to control the ultimate thing, life.
Welcome to the rebellion.
Now you're in my womb. I want you out. Stand out. We must fight.
The representative just told us that host is the best term he could find. What term would you use?
Woman.
Give a moment for that to sink in. As was highlighted in the trailer and in the documentary as a whole, Wisconsin has this terrible law that was brought against Tammy Loertscher, as described in the trailer, Act 292. And that law allows the state to put a pregnant person in jail, force them into medical treatment, or put them on house arrest based on a suspicion that they are pregnant and that they have consumed or may in the future consume alcohol or controlled substance during their pregnancy. And one of the most, of all of the egregious aspects of this law, one of the most egregious things that always jumped out at me was that the fetus is guaranteed a lawyer and the pregnant person is not. And so obviously, if someone did want to seek an abortion, that's going to be a barrier to them seeking that care. And so this law, Act 292, is sometimes referred to as the Unborn Child Protection Act or the cocaine mom law, but that is clear window dressing. This is a decade after the cocaine scares of the 80s. And this law was explicitly driven by anti-abortion activists who were trying to get the term unborn child in the books and undermine pregnant people's personhood and civil rights and undermine the right to abortion. This continues to be extremely prevalent in Wisconsin. And as a reminder, we are taking a moment focusing on Wisconsin just as an example for the national scale, and I will turn to the national scene as well. But in Wisconsin, just under this law, there are about 460 cases a year where pregnant people have conditions imposed on them, and approximately 1,200 cases a year where people face an investigation and the stress of that, even if they don't ultimately have an arrest or rights taken from them. And I do just want to mention for a moment that this law has been found unconstitutional by a federal court. It's not being, it continues to be used because a higher court vacated that decision, but they did not overturn it. So it's still substantively good reasoning that folks can use in their advocacy, lawyers and others. And I do want to note that if you or someone you know is facing one of these cases, please reach out to us at NAPW. We have resources to help you challenge these cases in court. And we're also looking for plaintiffs to bring a new civil challenge to the law as a whole. So if you or someone you know is facing one of these cases, please, please, please reach out. And as with all of these laws nationwide, we know that Act 292 harms pregnant people and their developing pregnancies and children. And an independent research organization, Pew Charitable Trusts, did that research in Wisconsin for the governor and found that Act 292 discourages people from seeking treatment and medical care for themselves and their families. So turning to the national scene, Wisconsin's law is technically in the civil code, even though it can lead to arrests and jail time. Nationally, NAPW tracks criminal cases against pregnant people because of their pregnancies or pregnancy outcomes. Sorry about the sirens. And in that context, there are hundreds of people who faced arrest and criminal charges because of their pregnancy. These graphics are slightly outdated. We've actually documented over 1,000 cases from 2006 to 2020. And all of these numbers are probably an undercount because criminal cases brought against pregnant people because of their pregnancy aren't brought under any single law. But all of these policies are really driven by anti-abortion activists. The National Right to Life Committee has been very explicit about that this is a policy of theirs, trying to create laws finding that the death of a fetus is a homicide, and any type of fetal harm law, because they think it will change the hearts and minds of the public on abortion. And I think we're seeing that play out with these hundreds of arrests, people charged with crimes because they can't control the outcome of their pregnancy, as no one can. The other way that this plays out that I think is important to highlight and doesn't get as much attention is with respect to forced medical intervention, so this example is from the case of Renat Dre in Staten Island, where the doctor wrote, "Woman has decisional capacity. I have decided to override her refusal to have a C-section," and they forced her to have a C-section. And so this dynamic where fetuses are thought of as separate entities from pregnant people, which obviously they're not, and people are seeking to imbue fetuses with separate rights from pregnant people, that inherently always will require the infringement on pregnant people's rights, their rights to bodily autonomy, to medical decision-making, and to make their own choices for themselves and whether to carry their pregnancy to term or to end it. And I think there's three things that are important to keep in mind as we're thinking about these laws. So first is that neither the pregnant person nor their doctor can guarantee a healthy pregnancy outcome. And these cases are driven by an idea that pregnant people can control their pregnancy outcome and are creating unreasonable risks to their pregnancy. But it's not within their control. Second, that pregnant people have the right to make medical decisions for themselves, including terminating a pregnancy or choices that would endanger their own lives or the continuation of their pregnancy. And that's been affirmed by the American Medical Association, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the United States Supreme Court. And third, that policing pregnant people for risk to their pregnancy can extend to all aspects of their lives. There's a case where a woman fell down the stairs while pregnant and was charged with attempted illegal abortion. And so it really just could extend to any action that could create any type of risk, which is everything. And that's contrary to the recommendations of every leading medical organization to speak on the subject. This is just a sampling of those organizations, which universally say the best way to protect babies and grow healthy children is to provide confidential, non-threatening healthcare that keeps mothers engaged in treatment if they need it and keeps mothers and babies together. I have to skip along, but I do just want to highlight that while, as we've touched briefly on, there are many different drivers of these cases against pregnant people, about 85% of cases relate to drug use in pregnancy. I'm not, encouraging people to use drugs while pregnant. There are risks associated with that, but in utero exposure to meth, cocaine, opioids does not impact IQ, as has been commonly believed. And the risks and possible impacts that are described in literature are often indistinguishable, and in the research, they're indistinguishable from health impacts that come from poverty, malnourishment, and the lack of prenatal care, because those things are often present in the research subjects. And the things that we do know include that the evidence of risk of harm from cigarettes is far more established than evidence of risk of harm associated with the major criminalized drugs. But obviously we don't criminalize the use of cigarettes in the same way. This is just a little research around that. And we've touched on these points. So I do want to turn to our main question today, which is how can interdisciplinary professionals collaborate to protect pregnant people's rights? And I want to turn it over to Dr. Kathy Hartke, who is an extremely experienced OBGYN, the co-chair of Wisconsin's Maternal Mortality Review Team, and she serves on the steering committee of the Wisconsin Perinatal Quality Collaborative. Dr. Hartke has been actively involved in the Milwaukee Gynecological Society, the Wisconsin section of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And she's a clinical assistant professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She's been actively involved for years in combating Act 292, among many other bills in the Wisconsin legislature that either support or hurt the health of children, pregnant people, and families. So, Dr. Hartke, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for inviting me to participate in this very important panel today. This has, as you mentioned, been an ongoing problem for many years, and I first became aware of this in 2005 when I was called to the emergency room. I was on call for our local hospital to see a woman who was 29 weeks pregnant and had come asking for help. And I think this is so important that many of the times that women are placed in detention, it's that they are asking for help and they are not trying to harm their fetus. Rachel was at 29 weeks getting prenatal care from an obstetrician at a different hospital, but had not divulged the fact that she was taking some of her mother's Percocet. She came with her husband and her 2-year-old child. Both Rachel and her husband had jobs, and they were trying to get through this pregnancy as healthy as possible. By the time I got to the emergency room, and by the way, I'd called my mentor in advocacy, who was also a maternal fetal medicine specialist, to get his opinion as to how to handle her situation. And before I got there, they had called behavioral health, and the emergency physician had decided to call the police and invoke this law. She had been then subsequently evaluated by both maternal fetal medicine and addictionologists, and felt that she did not need to have specific treatment with methadone or buprenorphine, but that she could continue on this low dose of a narcotic during the rest of her pregnancy. That would be the most prudent way to handle her situation. However, because she was in a different county than where I was at in Waukesha County, she was a resident of Racine County, went through the courts there and the social work department, and was placed in a locked psychiatric unit at St. Luke's Hospital, where there were very sick psychiatric patients. Not only was she not treated for her substance supposed problem, but she was placed on Xanax, sleeping pills, and was so impacted by those that she could hardly speak on the telephone. After a couple of weeks, she was brought for the first court hearing in handcuffs and shackles on her ankles, as she was now 32 weeks pregnant and could barely walk because of being so pregnant with ankle shackles. I felt so strongly that this was wrong and went and testified on her behalf. She also did not get prenatal care during that time. So if they were trying to protect the fetus, they were sure not doing anything to help. In fact, they were harming her. I went to my national meeting and tried to find resources as to how to help them, and eventually found Lynn Paltrow and National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and worked with them. I went to a subsequent hearing where she was, by good fortune, a judge that was somewhat understanding of the situation and believed our testimony that she should not be in this unit and that she needed to be released, and she was. She subsequently delivered. I delivered her baby, and the baby was fine, and she was stable at that point. A year or two later, I got a call from an emergency room at another hospital that she had presented in labor with no prenatal care because she was not about to go through what she had gone through that first time. And this is what we've seen happening to women, that they avoid the healthcare system if they know what's going to happen or could happen to them. But many women don't, and many physicians, even though for years now we've worked on this, don't know that this law exists. Part of it's because it's kept confidential under the Children's Code. And until I was an expert witness for Tammy Loertscher that you saw in the video that was shown, we did not even know how many women were impacted by this. And it is hundreds of women that Child Protective Services gets involved with. And their initial goal, they said, by this law was to help protect the cocaine babies, which is a fallacy. They, now with research, we know that that is not a condition that is recognized. And there are so many other myths that are related to these things. Babies are not born addicted, yet newscasters continually say, the junkie babies or addicted babies do not have an addiction. It's a totally different disease. People don't understand that addiction is a relapsing medical illness. It's no different than other chronic illnesses like hypertension, diabetes. And for that matter, if we have laws like this that can take mothers into custody for not following what the law says or thinks is appropriate, say we have a mother, I have a patient that in the past was drinking a 6-pack of Coke every day and was diabetic. And we know that diabetes can cause stillbirth and other complications for fetuses. So would we put any woman who has another medical illness in jail because she's not following the recommendations and could potentially harm her fetus? So this can be used in so many bad ways besides the whole abortion issue. We know that American College now has not only information about what it is informed consent, but also informed refusal. And women have a right to care for their bodies the way that they see fit. And we should not have any judge telling us what to do with us. As a provider, the best thing I can do is to have an open, honest, trusting relationship, and that takes time to develop with a woman or person. I saw in the comment something about not referring to pregnant women, but there are now persons who have babies, so we need to be more broad about that. But we need to have that relationship to help the person have the healthiest pregnancy and find out what their goals are. Do they even want to continue a pregnancy? And in the case of Tammy, while she may have been able to get it if she had money, if she had the persons to contact to have an abortion, she did not want one. And most of these women want to have their babies. So we have got to start looking at this in a totally different way to help women have the most healthy outcome for themselves and the baby. ACOG came out with a program a couple years ago, put the M back in motherhood, because everything was focused on the fetus. And as a co-chair of maternal mortality, we are seeing many mothers die in Wisconsin and throughout the country 6 to 12 months after pregnancy. Sometimes women will go into a program and be totally withdrawn from all substances and then be put back out in the community with no resources, and then go back to the conditions that they were in when they may have been using to begin with. And we know that social determinants of health have got to be addressed in order to deal with the whole issue of why people even turn to a substance to begin with. So there are many aspects of this. We are working on this. In my county, there's a Women's Health and Recovery Project that was just granted money from the Department of Health Services. And we are working to make sure that it's done in the appropriate way, not in a punitive way or in a way that could potentially put women in jail where they end up in handcuffs, shackles, and in Tammy's case, in solitary confinement, which is the most abusive thing you can do to a pregnant woman. So thank you for this time, and I'll turn it back to Sam.
I'd like to turn next to Tamara Thompson. Tamara is an activist, lactation counselor, full spectrum doula, and childbirth educator, writer, aspiring midwife, and reproductive justice advocate who is central to the support system for people from Madison to Milwaukee and beyond who want to end their pregnancy or carry their pregnancy to term. And Tamara is a co-founder of the Wisconsin Doulas of Color Collective, Harambee Village, and Maroon Calabash, which is an Afro-Indigenous birthwork cooperative. And I'd like to turn it over to Tamara.
Peace, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and the people that I serve, and then I will go into a little bit of storytelling to kind of shed light on some of the things that we already heard from Dr. Hartke a moment ago, and just some ideas that I have about what can be done. The majority of the people who seek my care as a doula that is very active in 2 different communities, most of the people that I serve are in Madison, and a small number of the people that I care for seek me out that live in Milwaukee. Most of those people desire a natural birthing experience. To some people, natural could mean a number of things. It could mean unmedicated. For some people, it just means that the baby was birthed vaginally. But people have really strong ideas about how they want to birth, where they want to birth, if they want to breastfeed. They really are intentional about choosing their healthcare providers, and they prioritize their health and well-being. These are people who are seeking a doula who really have rights and ideas that they want to be protected. So these are people who take it upon themselves to be informed and vigilant about their position within the healthcare system, which can be scary for some people, depending on if they've had previous experiences that did not go well, or if it's their first time, and so on. So in my care, when there was a person who had a relapse, she called the nurse line at her primary care physician's office, even though she had a midwife, because she really wanted to get some treatment. She really wanted to get some help. Instead of getting the help that she needed, she was arrested and placed in custody. And this was a cascade of events that happened specifically for her. And this happened in Dane County. As a result of disclosing her relapse, her prenatal care was ended with her midwife. She no longer had access to the soft and gentle care that she relied on. And the midwifery model of care is vastly different than the medical model of care. And even still, within a healthcare system where people are not always given the same things when they're in jail as if they had private insurance and they were going to a clinic or that nature. She no longer had access to education for lactation, readying to getting her baby prepared to breastfeed, childbirth education. Those types of things weren't even available in the jail. There were no books, there were no resources, none of those things, just being told no. And then there were shackles, as we heard also from Dr. Hartke, on her feet, impromptu visits to a new medical care provider, and being spoken to in a way that wasn't respectful, that was condescending. She would make remarks about the nutrition, and the healthcare provider, the obstetrician, was kind of flippant and was kind of like you actually want to eat healthy food. You want to be eating fruits and vegetables. What are you expecting here? And then actually not having access to that nutrition and understanding that there was lead found in the water in the Dane County jail was a really big deal. But not getting that attention drawn to that situation, not having any other alternative was a big issue. Another client that I had was in Milwaukee County. She was a victim of domestic violence. And this particular person knew that she was pregnant and was kind of on the fence if she wanted to continue that pregnancy because of the nature of her relationship. When the police were called and got involved, she was investigated. I actually got a phone call from a caseworker wanting to know what kind of mother she was, what kind of personality she had. Was she a bad person? Was she dangerous? Was she involved in drugs? A number of things that I was personally asked about this client, kind of impeding upon her privacy. She was arrested, placed in the county jail in Milwaukee. She missed work, she lost her job, she missed car payments because she had previous conviction. She was under court supervision. And so it was really easy for them to have what we call a crimeless revocation, where they throw a person in jail and they figure out what happened later. She was forced to disclose whether she had broken up with the boyfriend or if she was going to still be with the boyfriend. And there was a lot of suspicion where even people from the agency were calling me and saying, do you think she's still with him? Do you think she's still with him? And again, the same thing that we were seeing in Dane County, the poor nutrition, the drinking water, not feeling safe about consuming it, paying high rates to communicate with family members, to care for her older child. I mean, it really changed the trajectory of how her entire life happened. And as a result, there was a mental health crisis while she was in jail, and wanting to have access to information about abortion. Because I'm a full spectrum doula, my care covers people who have all kinds of outcomes, whether they choose to terminate their pregnancy, rather they give their babies up for adoption. I provide support for people in all of those different scenarios. So I want to ask, what if policy didn't affect people's freedom in the first place? So as we were hearing Dr. Hartke talk about before, just like bouncing off of what she was saying, substance use would be seen as a health issue, rather than criminal activity for all people, rather than just privileged ones. One thing that really stood out for me as a new person, I was at the hospital for my daughter who was having an asthma attack in Oconomowoc, and I noticed a pamphlet, and I picked it up and I noticed that there was a whole program for people who are using opioids and are also pregnant. And I thought, I would never see this in a waiting room in Milwaukee. I would never see this. There's a criminalization that is automatic based on what that patient looks like, what their social economic status is, their marital status, and the whole 9 yards. If people who are in the midst of domestic violence, like my client was, already having a plan, already working with me on what she's going to do, already thinking about what am I going to do about this pregnancy, had she not been criminalized and seen as an accomplice to her own abuse, that would be one way that policy would not have interfered with her freedom and her autonomy to make a choice about what she was going to do with her pregnancy. Reserving the rights to make decisions for themselves in their pregnancy. And we would help avoid all of the evictions, mounting debt, loss of income, family destabilization would be all avoided. Like we see now all of these signs and rhetoric where people are saying, nobody wants to work, nobody wants to work, but we're separating people from their livelihood while people are actively making those kinds of comments. If every professional who works with pregnant people, with women, can prioritize their rights, these are some things that I think they could do. As much as we like to talk about systems and change in laws, I really like to start with confronting everyone's personal bias, because every committee and board and legislative body is made up of people, and those people not confronting their biases and what they think about people is where it all starts. So I think starting with confronting personal bias, utilizing community-based organizations and resources rather than calling the police. Say, for instance, a nurse knows that a person has used drugs and they may or may not be pregnant, or they may or may not even be using drugs. Instead of calling the police, understanding that this person is going to have their whole pregnancy, their whole life disrupted, calling on a resource in the community for people who are battling addiction. If this person had a previous relationship with an AODA treatment center, calling them instead of the police and saying, oh, well, we just washed our hands of that person and they'll take care of it and they'll deal with it. We're all a part of this chain of command. I think more people could evaluate and address the protocols within their own organizations. Like a person who works in a hospital, what is the protocol when a person says in their history that they have had substance use in their history? Do we automatically flag that person? Do we call outside? Do we get that person in trouble? I think people using their professional influence to identify the problematic practices that create the change, across the sectors is what's really, really needed, where we have people working in silos, but instead working together to say, you know what, whenever I refer someone to your program, this is the outcome and this is what happens. Getting involved in the legislative process. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm the only person that really, really cares, to talk about it as much as I do. Maybe people on my Facebook friends list are sick of me talking about laws, but it really does matter that we get involved and we're vocal about it, that we show up and we talk to our representative, our congressperson, that we testify in support or not in support of certain laws, and let people know that where I work, like Humanize, like the people that I work with are directly affected by the laws that you're creating, and it inadvertently destabilizes an entire community. So yeah, those are my ideas. Those are the things that I really wanted to highlight for you all today. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Sam.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And thank you for sharing all of those stories from your experience and your client's experience, as well as calls to action for all of us to think about this for our own selves, and also what community-based referrals we can make as professionals, and how we can challenge how this plays out in our own workplaces and the institutions that we're involved in, and political action and legislative advocacy. So thank you so much for that. I want to turn now to a question from one of our co-sponsors. Courtney Hayward is here from Planned Parenthood of Wisconsin. I don't know if you have questions for our panelists at this mid-stage.
Yes. And thank you guys for having this awesome event. And it's an honor for Planned Parenthood to sponsor or be a co-sponsor at this event. My question is, I know that in 2017, Senator Lena Taylor introduced a bill called the Anti-Shackling Bill, which will essentially overturn provisions in Act 22. My question is, what do you guys think are the biggest barriers that prevent bills like that from getting passed?
Well, I've been working with our American College of OBGYN state lobbyists that I hired about 4 years ago to work with our section. We had a call with the two state sheriff law enforcement agency leaders about 1.5 years ago. And they're still, the law enforcement just does not think that women should have any special provision for not using shackles. And these laws were developed years ago when primarily men were the persons incarcerated. The county jails are the worst places for pregnant women, as you've heard, and I can tell you many more horrible stories about the jails and the treatment of these women. But they feel like they're a risk that, and they shouldn't be treated differently than men. So it's an upward battle. I've been talking with a medical student. I've tried to mentor young students and residents to be advocates. And one was doing a program in Milwaukee that she was trying to work with Senator Taylor's office. Again, I think one of the problems with Senator Taylor's two bills was that it did not have bipartisan support. And some people in the lobbyist world have said that Senator Taylor can be somewhat abrasive in the legislature, and so she doesn't always get support from other legislators. So we've got to figure out a way to get other legislators involved, and it passed out of committee 5-0. So it had great support. I testified, I got other people to testify, and it's not like it's unsupported, but we also have the Assembly Speaker, Boss, and the Senate Majority Leader, who now is LeMahieu, but it was Scott Fitzgerald, who have control over what gets put up for a vote, and it was not put up for a vote. And so I've also worked with the county jails trying to, again, particularly in Waukesha, and I've contacted the county executive, the county jails, the medical director of the county jail. They will not release any of their policies on treatment of pregnant women unless I get an open records request to them. I mean, this is the attitude that we're dealing with. They want to punish, 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 and we've got to educate the public as well as law enforcement. I've just proposed that we have when we launch the work project in Waukesha, that we have Judge Everett Mitchell, who is a wonderful advocate for helping women with substance use, present a program where people would be invited to help them start to process this and understand more about the problem.
If I could just add one little thing to answer the question on what is the barrier, it's racism. Because a Black woman who opens her mouth and speaks affirmatively and says declarative sentences and doesn't make apologies or soften what she's saying is seen as aggressive and is seen as combative. And when Senator Lena Taylor says exactly what's up and what's happening, people do not like that. I also testified in 2017, and I understood that the temperature in the room is that a person who is asking for respect and dignity can't do that while also being in jail. That if you're arrested, it's assumed that you're a bad person, and that somehow being removed from the loving embrace of your child is something that you deserve. And so that's why I talk a lot about confronting our own bias, because these are all systems that are made up of people who have really terrible ideas and attitudes about what it means to be a human, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be pregnant, and all of those things. But the bottom line is the barrier is racism and misogyny. And I'll go a little bit further and say misogynoir, and that's the specific misogyny against a Black woman.
I totally agree with everything you said, Tim. The other interesting thing we found out was that in many county jails, because they're so afraid of pregnant women in their jail, they just let them go. So we have totally different rules and ways of treating people that are just not fair and equitable. And yes, I think if you're in certain counties, you're going to be treated way worse than others.
Yeah. Thank you both for that. And thank you, Courtney, for that question. For those of you seeking, credit for your attendance in today's event, the first word is advocate. Ooh, advocate. So if you need that for your continuing education credit as a lawyer, social worker, doula, or other professional, your first word is advocate. And next, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tawandra Raul-Consolo, who's a researcher who examines the intersection between the criminal justice system and health outcomes. Her long-term goal is to develop sustainable evidence-based interventions that address the intersection of health and justice. So with that, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I think you'll start to see that there's a lot of overlap between all of our presentations, which is good. I think that it just means that we're on the same page. So I'll just go through this quickly because some of it you've already heard. I wanted to sort of start out with just a brief discussion about the US correctional population. There are currently over 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in the US. And of course, this disproportionately impacts members from marginalized populations. The vast majority of those who are involved in the criminal legal system, number one, they were incarcerated for a drug-related offense. So this could be possession, this could be trafficking, but most of them are very low level, what they call low level offenders. Either they use substances during the commission of a crime. So even if they're not incarcerated for a substance use related offense, they were either drunk or high while they were committing a burglary or a robbery or something like that. Or they have been diagnosed with the substance use disorder. So substance use has definitely had an incredible impact on the US carceral system over the past several decades. And if you look at, I'm going to focus now on the state of Wisconsin. If you look at the state of Wisconsin incarceration rates, they are disproportionately high. The US is always number one. We've held that distinction for a while now in terms of the number of its residents that it incarcerates. And the state of Wisconsin has one of the highest incarceration rates in the US. So Wisconsin is definitely good at enforcing its laws. So this just means that literally it is off the charts because it could barely fit on this chart. So there are about 676 per 100,000 people incarcerated in Wisconsin. So it's a lot, especially compared to other democracies. And I feel like I can't discuss that without saying something about the racial and ethnic disparities in the state of Wisconsin. When you look at the numbers of their representation in the state population, so for instance, for Black people, they represent, and these numbers are a little off, but honestly, the numbers don't change drastically from year to year. And this is the state of Wisconsin, but this could be any state in the US, honestly. The rates are comparable to what you'll see in other states as well. So for Black people in the state of Wisconsin, they make up about 6% of the population, but 38% of the correctional population. So they're definitely overrepresented in prisons and jails in the state of Wisconsin, as opposed to whites who make up about 83% of the state population, but about 52%. So whenever there are policies, whenever there are laws, they're definitely enforced disproportionately against Black residents in this state. And I wanted to say something about addiction because I think we're sort of moving away from decades ago where we thought about substance use as a reflection of poor upbringing or a moral failure. I think more recently, people are now starting to recognize that addiction is defined, is a chronic relapsing brain disease. It's not necessarily a choice that people make. And for pregnant people, it's not that they are intentionally trying to hurt their fetus. Addiction is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. So a lot of people have challenges and difficulties when they're trying to abstain from using substances. And I think that that is something that should be guiding a lot of the policies that are currently being developed. In the US, substance use or addiction is typically criminalized. And that's what we do. We use punitive measures, which honestly have the opposite impact on a fetus. And I'll go into that in another slide. But I should say that relapse is high among substance users, and it's comparable to people with other chronic conditions as well. But one thing, and this is something that I don't think has been discussed enough, not in this panel, but just generally, is that addiction is manageable even for pregnant individuals. So you'll see that with proper treatment and access to quality care, that you can give birth even when you are under the influence. Not that I'm recommending that, but I think that people automatically assume that the tools that we have to treat addiction in non-pregnant people can't be used for pregnant people, and that's just not true. Research has shown that you can have positive health outcomes using the tools that have been created and used with people who are not pregnant. And so, unfortunately, when pregnant people are sent to carceral settings for using substances, it interferes with their healthcare access. And this has been mentioned before, because what you're doing is you're taking people out of their communities. You're asking them, and for those who are fortunate enough to have access to care while they're incarcerated, you're forcing them to interact with a different set of providers. A lot of the policies that we're seeing stigmatize substance use, which reduces the likelihood of a pregnant person receiving quality care. Because if you think, and which someone has mentioned before, that you're going to be incarcerated or somehow penalized, then you're much more likely to seek prenatal care for substance use and for your other needs as well. This can cause psychological distress. And when you're incarcerated, unfortunately, if you are one of those people who are diagnosed with a substance use disorder, only 11% of them receive care or addiction treatment once they're incarcerated. So again, you're placing them in a setting where they're much less likely to get the care and support that they need. And it drastically varies from institution to institution, even within states. Some people get very little care, some people get a high level of care, but just remember that the correctional system wasn't designed as a public health institution. It's to penalize, it's to sort of preserve public safety is what it says. But honestly, in those settings, pregnant women aren't treated much differently than other people. So they don't necessarily get the care and support that they need or anything that would be comparable to what they may receive in their communities. And unfortunately, if you're incarcerated while you're pregnant, you are going to face inadequate nutrition because these are things, menus are created in advance, and they don't necessarily make, again, a distinction for someone who is pregnant. You're going to have compromised rest. There are always lights on in correctional facilities. You don't get to decide if you want exercise, if you want some fresh air, if you want to have a better roommate, if you're not sent to solitary confinement. I mean, your choices are very limited. Your options are very limited if you're in a correctional setting. And this is something that could have a huge impact on care, right? Also, you don't necessarily have control over whether you have access to care. Some state systems actually charge you for gaining access to care. And so if you don't have the money to actually see a physician, then you may not be able to do that. Also, for those who already have children and they're pregnant with one or more children, then you're separated from your children, which could also exacerbate existing mental health conditions. Also, and you've heard this before, that some prisons require that women be shackled during labor or even before they're given or before they're in labor, which is problematic because they're the least likely to present a flight risk at that period. And even though you're starting to see a number of laws change that, it's still, from what I see, it's still being enforced differently. Again, even in institutions within the same state system. You are not necessarily, just because it's a law or a policy doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I agree with what I think Tamara was saying, that it depends also on how the person who is pregnant is viewed by correctional officials. They can very likely say, you know what, I had to do this because this is someone who was aggressive. So that's unfortunate. But again, for people who are using substances, a lot of times they're sent to these places and they're experiencing these scenarios where it's doing more harm than it is good. So I felt like a lot of what I said here has already been said, but I just wanted to say, just wanted to emphasize a couple of things that I went over, that legal system involvement is a common experience for substance users. Unfortunately, instead of enrolling them or asking them to be engaged in substance use treatment outside of correctional settings, you're seeing a lot of people going to prisons and jails, regardless of if they're pregnant or not, for substance use treatment, and only a very few are getting quality treatment that they need. So we're penalizing pregnant individuals for substance use, and it has lasting consequences. It's not that they're just experiencing that while they're incarcerated, even when they come out. Now they have this label, and that's going to follow them for the rest of their lives. Also, I just wanted to emphasize that addiction is a chronic condition that can be managed very effectively. I've seen it a lot during pregnancy, which also helps to improve the quality of the prenatal care that they'll receive. Instead of criminalizing and incarcerating them, healthcare access should be facilitated, and that's very difficult to do in correctional settings. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I would add just that addiction can be managed, but also even when it's not well managed, sometimes people are still fully able to have a healthy birth and to parent. And there's lots of people, I think myself in the audience, if you're not yourself a recreational drug user, you know someone who is, who continues to go about their effective day, work life, and parenting life. And people are policed clearly differently based on their race, their location, and their income level. When they're in those types of situations, if folks want to learn more about how that plays out in the family regulation system, the so-called child welfare system, Movement for Family Power's Ground Zero report is a great resource for those of you who are signed up for credit. It's in your resources that have been shared, and it's also will be shared in the chat. I want to turn finally to Joe Artinger, who's the writer, director, producer, and editor of the documentary Personhood, Policing Pregnant Women in America. Jo is an award-winning director, editor, and story consultant working on both documentary and narrative films. And her documentary Personhood, that we've talked about a few times, has won several awards, including the American Bar Association's 2020 Silver Gavel Award for documentaries. She's currently working on the feature documentary Clearwater about the special relationship of Pacific Northwest tribal people to the Salish Sea. And she's an instructor at the University of Washington in Seattle, where she teaches digital storytelling and in the realm of science. And Jo, I was hoping you could start us off with, as you were thinking about making this documentary, Personhood, what brought you to the topic of personhood for this documentary?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me too. It's really great to hear all of this Wisconsin-centric stuff after working on the film for so long. And, you know, I came to Personhood because I was ready to make a documentary of my own. And it was in the wake of the 2010 elections when there was this onslaught of new regulations and restrictions being passed. And I've always been interested and passionate about this area, so I wanted to focus there. And then I saw a segment on Rachel Maddow about a personhood amendment in Mississippi. And that really hooked me because I'd never heard of fetal personhood, the ramifications, especially as Rachel Maddow can only do breaking it down, just they were so far reaching. And I thought, okay, I haven't seen a film on this topic before. And as I approached it, I thought I would be making a film about how personhood laws would affect access to abortion and IVF and everything that was being covered in the media. And I kind of I got onto an article in the New York Times about what had happened in El Salvador in the late 90s when they passed their fetal personhood amendment to their constitution. And I thought I had an interesting question, like what would happen if America became a personhood nation? Would we in fact then start arresting and prosecuting women for pregnancy loss? And, you know, then the first article came up in my searches as I started getting more specific about the woman who had fallen down the stairs and had been arrested. You know, the idea was that she had fallen down the stairs on purpose and while pregnant. And I thought, oh, you know, this is the film I need to make about what's already happening in America, because this criminalizing and targeting of pregnant people had already arrived many, many years earlier. And so I just had to start digging through the cases and to see, you know, can we ask a different question? What happens when these personhood laws or fetal protection laws are passed? What is the ripple effect that, how far does that reach go into people's lives with the capacity for pregnancy? And so there's so many great films that covered the topic of abortion. And I thought, why don't we try to lift this issue up? Because these articles they were so few and far between, and they're not getting the right kind of attention in the media. And I thought it made for a very interesting and necessary story. And that's what brought me to National Advocates for Pregnant Women, and started this incredible learning process for me. And it also is how I got connected to Tammy Loertscher and started this many, many years journey with Tammy. And as I was looking at all of the slides from the previous presenters, all of these statistics that we're looking at, I witnessed in this human person, Tammy Loertscher. I saw her go through all of the things and consequences we've talked about, the stigma, you know, just how it impacted her day-to-day life as a parent, as a partner, her attitude towards getting medical treatment for her very important health issues. And so that's kind of how I came to personhood laws and why I thought it was so important. And once I got to know Tammy and her story, I just feel stories like Tammy's and, it's so important to humanize their experiences. So, if you're following along those slides, if you have a chance to take in the film, which has been made available, you'll be able to also track Tammy's experiences, while she was incarcerated, how they treated her while she was incarcerated, her lack of access to her very necessary medication. She's quite lucky she didn't lose her pregnancy while she was being held.
Yeah, and something I thought was so powerful about how you framed the movie was you really used Tammy's story to highlight and humanize how this affects an individual person, but put it in the context of many other laws across the country. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about how you see these types of laws playing out elsewhere around.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. They pop up in so many different forms, but these laws are in place, and pregnant people are being impacted by this, even in states where we wouldn't expect that we would see these laws. We've seen efforts, in Alabama or in Tennessee, and we understand that these are states that are very anxious to ban abortion. But I was surprised that I came upon these cases in Wisconsin. We've seen cases in New York City and in California. So it seems that, wherever there are people who are interested in controlling pregnant people's behavior and their bodies, and punishing people for their behaviors, you're going to find a law that can be twisted and used in this manner. In the film, we covered a couple of ways they crop up. One is through state ballot initiatives. We've seen many examples of that, and we covered Colorado's third personhood ballot initiative. And what I think is so important about that particular case is that even though each time the voters had to face one of these personhood amendments, the first one was very blatant. It just laid it all out there, what they were trying to do, which is to add fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses to the state constitution. Each time it got a little more window dressing and got a little bit more confusing. And the particular effort that we cover in the film, they took a tragic case, and this is how it often, these laws come to pass. There will be some kind of tragic occurrence, and then they, where, a pregnant person and their fetus is impacted, and then they craft a law because there's such an outcry. And these are terrible cases and terrible tragedies, but the answer then isn't then to go create laws that can be used to target and criminalize pregnant people. So they crop up as personhood ballot initiatives. They crop up as, variety of different laws. I just read yesterday about a law, the chemical endangerment law that we've seen be used hundreds of times against women in Alabama. There's this new case with a woman, Kim Blaylock, who actually was arrested for taking a medication that her doctor legally prescribed to her. And so this case is now starting, and the kind of backflips that the police and that they're going through to try to find a way to twist this law to apply to this person. And it's pretty frightening to see that they're kind of, massaging these laws as they go to try to make them apply to individual cases. And one of the things I remember about Wisconsin's law is that it isn't applied equally across the state. It's applied very differently in different counties. So who's ever in charge, it depends on what their level of interest is in applying these laws, So it's unfair at its, of course it's unfair, and the way it's applied is unfair. And some people do things in one county and they're not looked at in other counties, especially where Tammy lived. They were very, very interested in putting her in jail. And so many of these laws are passed with protections for pregnant people. And then we find that it depends on who's in charge or how administrations switch, that then those protections are no longer. And so these are the ways we see it crop up. And then, of course, we see efforts at the federal level. And there's always some kind of, federal personhood legislation in the mix, which has never really been successful. But where we see all of the efforts turn to is, what can we do at the Supreme Court level? And now this is what we're facing now with this new case that the court will be hearing in the fall. And I think that's got everyone worried for very good reason, because where states have these laws and where they are very interested in banning abortion, that's where we find they're also extremely interested in targeting and punishing and prosecuting pregnant people for a variety of things.
Thank you so much, Jo. I want to turn now in our last 20 minutes to questions from the audience. So a question from Christina for all of you. Do pregnant people have any rights to medical care while they are in jail?
Legally, I can answer that. Legally, they have rights to medical care, but there really isn't a standard of care, high quality care, and the type of care that they have access to depends on so many factors. And they don't necessarily receive a standard of healthcare that they will receive in their community. And I don't see much about standards of care, honestly, but they legally do have a right to medical care while they're pregnant.
The American College of OBGYN has a whole recommendation for that and what should be covered. They have said in the hearings that they don't want to cover STI testing and treatment, although we know that these women oftentimes have been trafficked and will be high risk for having that, because it's all about the money, and it's all about the money at the county level. And I will say that I have spoken to the medical director at the county jail after getting calls from our family practice program that has the mothers at MAT treatment for moms. They got this woman buprenorphine treatment during the pregnancy, and she was shackled during labor. They took the shackles off just before delivery and immediately put them back on as soon as she delivered, even though she had an epidural. And the doctors, the nurses, everybody pleaded with the sheriff not to do this, but then sent her back to the jail after she delivered, and they stopped treatment. So now you've got a woman who has been the most, willing to get treatment. She's doing well, she's in treatment, and they send her back and they cut her off. And their rationale is, we only treat the fetus, we don't treat the mother. So this is just total abuse of women, persons that can deliver an infant. It's just abusive.
I wanted to say something else. I think even if there are standards of care available, I think one of the problems is that the pregnant person doesn't necessarily know about them. It's not like anyone informs them that this is what you are entitled to while you're here. And I think that complicates the issue too, because they don't understand or realize what they should be receiving there. And I think that's very unfortunate.
And I just wanted to add too, because this is so parallel to Tammy's experience. The other thing is, even before they get to that stage, people's assumptions are, and I see these words a lot, I thought if I went to the doctor and asked for help, I would get that help. Or I thought if I took a prescription that was legally given to me by my physician, that I'd be okay. And so what's happening is, not only do people not know what they're allowed to receive while they're incarcerated, all the assumptions that we make as patients with HIPAA and all of this, these are going out the window. And Tammy had no idea this law existed. And of course, if she did, she said she never would have sought help. And this is not about protecting babies. This is not about making sure that children have healthy parents and a healthy life. Clearly, they wouldn't be treating people this way if it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I do, for those of you who are here for credit, I have a second word for you, personhood. Your second word is personhood. So put that in your form to get credit. And I want to turn to our next question from Dawn. What are some state policies that are detrimental to the rights of pregnant people? And what are some state policies that strengthen the rights of pregnant people? In particular, policies that might not be as obvious, but are impactful.
I could add that the crimeless revocation one is high on my list of what I see for people that I serve, which means that a person could be on probation for whatever reason. They're complying with all of the terms of their previous release, and years later, now they're a mom. They're pregnant. They're ready to start a whole new life, and the smallest thing, like for a person who is vulnerable, someone could call their PO and say, you know what, Jane Doe just did something illegal and I saw her do it. And they're doing that to retaliate or to get that person in trouble, knowing that all it takes is a phone call. And that person can be in jail for a few hours, a few weeks, a few months because of that phone call, because it's to incarcerate them and then ask questions later. I even had one of my clients who was forced to give her Facebook password, like her login credentials, to her probation officer so that her probation officer could, track and see what she was up to. What are you doing? Are you smoking weed? And that type of thing was necessary in order to get out. And you're talking about a desperate person who wants to get back to their other children, their job. They don't want to miss too much, things that are on the outside that they've got hanging in the balance. And so they're willing to give, a pint of blood or their social security number, their mother's, maiden name, whatever they have to say to get out of jail. And that crimeless revocation can be really, really difficult, considering the fact that, like we saw in the slide that talked about how Wisconsin is already having people in the system for all kinds of things. So if a person is already under court supervision, they can go back at any time, whether they're pregnant or not.
Anyone else want to add to policies that could be hurtful or helpful to pregnant people?
The passage of the First Step Act, which was perhaps one of the only things that was good about the last administration, has Title V, which is specifically dedicated to treatment of pregnant women incarcerated. And it sets out guidelines for how to treat women and not shackling, providing medical care, things like that. That's a federal law. We already know that there are several states that have anti-shackling laws. The problem is that when they've looked into them, they're not being appropriately used, and women are still being incarcerated and shackled in those states. So there is some hope in that we can use that First Step Act as we advocate in our state and set that as the highest level. The prisons have much different rules about caring for pregnant women. State prisons, for example, have a national standard. However, again, it doesn't trickle down to the counties. Minnesota just reversed their mandatory reporting of substance use in pregnancy, which was a huge win. I have some colleagues in that state that I'm going to be working with. So I think this is a time to say, we're not giving up. We're going to continue to press forward. We're going to continue to network and do the things that we're doing today, because we can make a difference.
Thank you. And I'll just piggyback off that. I mean, one of the, a major problem for folks who are giving birth and are getting pulled into either the criminal or the family regulation system is being reported at birth for either themselves or their baby having a positive toxicology. And as you all know, positive toxicology doesn't say anything about the amount of use, the riskiness of use, whether it's problematic in any way. And it doesn't say anything about whether or not someone can parent their child safely. So it absolutely should not be the basis for a child neglect report unless there's other reasons, which would be their own independent reasons for a report. And there's actually a bill under consideration in Massachusetts right now, House Bill 211, I believe, to eliminate mandated reporting for positive toxicology at birth, similar to what Minnesota just did. And so I think those can be really impactful as well. How might recent legislation which restricts and or outright bans abortion access act as political tools for having SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, review Roe, and how much protection do state decisions afford?
I was going to say that the legislation is actually designed to create a challenge to Roe, right? So I think that's, if I'm reading the question correctly, in a lot of these cases or these laws that we see, the bans that pop up, they're designed specifically to try to make it to the Supreme Court. And many of these challenges didn't get that far, but with the new makeup of the court, that's what's so dangerous about this new decision is they've taken up this case that's very similar to one that was previously decided. So I don't know, we don't know what that means. You know, we don't have a crystal ball, but I think they're specifically designed for that purpose.
Yeah. A different sort of genre of question, how can we structure easily accessible community models of advocates and caregivers to work with a pregnant person to ensure their rights and autonomy throughout gestation or termination? Tams, I feel like this is really for you, but I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, I was jumping at the question, but I'm not sure I understand it. They're asking how?
How can we structure easily accessible community models of advocates and caregivers to work with a pregnant person to ensure their rights and autonomy through gestation or termination?
There are layers to it. I mean, there are so many layers. So the community-based organizations that exist sometimes start off as a kitchen table operation of a person who is highly motivated and enthusiastic to see something happen or to see something exist that doesn't exist. And it's really hard to get funding, and it's really hard to get started as a business that provides care. 20 years ago, people thought of doulas as kind of like, whoa, like, ooh, it's something that's a luxury. It's for wealthy white women. It's not something that is for everybody, and it's all touchy-feely, right? And now we've got a different understanding of what doulas do, what midwives do, lactation counselors, childbirth educators, people who are well experienced and cross-trained in AODA and incarceration, and all sorts of things. And so when you see these community-based organizations that are really struggling to keep their doors open and to keep a steady flow of referrals coming in, it's already layered, like stacked against them on how they're going to be able to be effective. And so a lot of times what we see community-based organizations do is partner with larger institutions, and that's good, and also can have a drawback to it that if the institution is the reason why we have the problem in the first place, and the community-based organization is now an extension of the institution, where people might be expecting doulas to force their people to comply, to force reporting, to disclose certain things. In some cases, you'll be in the hospital setting and a person's rights are being infringed upon, and the doula is kind of like checked, like if you say something or if you do something or if you record or if you report, then there's going to be penalty against them. So it takes a lot of effort And it takes a lot of people with long-term skin in the game. It can't be temporary or short-term. It really has to be something that people are dedicated to. And there's got to be people willing to put their money where their mouth is. There's so many people that say that they want these things and they do a lot of lip service and they might show up and wear a controversial t-shirt, but you really can't get them to show up and really dedicate their energies to seeing it through. So a lot of times what I would like to say that I see more of is people who have advisory boards, organizations that have advisory boards that are made up of people who are actually affected by the problem. So I would say having less people who are involved with, you know, the university, with the hospitals and the clinics and the insurance companies, as much as you center people who are formerly incarcerated and also pregnant, parenting, all sorts of things that really guide what happens inside of those things, those bodies, and shape the policies of what happens in that building. Because what happens when a person calls the police, you know, a nurse or a social worker calls the police, can be the last extent, the last thing that we do. But inside of that building of public health department, what are we going to do as the nurse family, the home nurse visitor that goes and sees a problem? That's what I've got. I could go on for hours. I could talk forever.
I think we really have to educate the community, the nursing staff, the social workers in our state believe that it's going to impact their licensing if they don't report. They feel like they have this requirement to report, or that they will be losing their license. I've had nurses say, you know, it would be better if I had a woman with twins who was using heroin but was not getting treatment while in the jail. They said it would be better if her babies died than if she got to take them home. And these are the kinds of attitudes that we're dealing with out there. And we have to help people understand addiction. I know obstetrical providers that just don't want to deal with it because it's complicated. There's social problems that are very vast that they, you know, go along with that. So until we can get rid of the stigma and the discrimination against people of color and people who have substance use, we're not going to make progress, and the laws won't change.
Yeah, thank you. We have just a few more minutes, so I want to see what else we can answer. Question from Karen is, what other states besides Wisconsin have these archaic laws on the books? And that's a little bit of a challenging question because Wisconsin actually is the only state with this level of extreme state intervention during pregnancy permitted that's written into their statutes. There's lots of other states where that's part of the practice in the family regulation system, but it's less explicit, or it only comes into effect at the moment of birth, which is still fully about actions or inactions during pregnancy, but doesn't allow the incarceration of someone who's pregnant. So it's a little bit different. And then on the criminal side, there's 3 states, South Carolina, Alabama, and Oklahoma, that have case law, so judge decisions, that allow criminal prosecution of pregnant people for actions or inactions during their pregnancy. And so those are the most challenging states to challenge those prosecutions. But those prosecutions, as Joe said, are happening all across the country. Wyoming, Missouri, California, New York, Montana, they're really all over. So unfortunately, whether or not there's a law in the books doesn't necessarily limit where we see these types of cases. The last question, I think, if each of you have a contribution, and then I'll share some upcoming events as well, is how can we educate the community about Act 292 and this fetal personhood topic? This is recorded, so you can send this recording to your friends and family and anyone you want to learn more about this, but if any of our panelists have contributions for how to help educate folks, I'd love you to jump in.
I'd do a quick chime in that, as a filmmaker and not as someone who works as an advocate, what are the ways that we can work together, and how can we create space for storytelling that helps lift up these stories? How can we each use our strengths and learn from each other and just keep working together? And so having access to watching the film and understanding what the human impact of these laws are. And then on our website, which is personhoodmovie.com, we also have a resources section where we keep adding additional resources, but you can go on there and see the various organizations that were featured in the film and the work that they're doing in their states. And I think we just need to kind of keep trying to work together in lifting these stories up and trying to work with the media. How do we get the narrative to change in the media so that we don't cover this issue as strictly access to abortion or not, which is very, very important. But if we start covering this issue from a broader sense, what are the real impacts of Act 292? And people are so shocked when they hear it. Hopefully people won't be shocked by these stories anymore. They'll know they exist, and that might help impact who's in power, is the hope.
Tams had posted earlier about the Omnibus Act. The Black Maternal Omnibus Act is a federal package of bills. Part of it is to address substance use and mental health problems for women, and we can all call our legislators to support that. Along with that, I've been giving talks now to different faith organizations. I just gave a talk to the Wisconsin State United Methodist Women Advocacy Day. These women had never heard of these problems, and they're horrified when they hear these things. I spoke to a Rotary Club in Madison. I spoke to the Wisconsin Association of Perinatal Care. And because of that, I've had additional people contact me. So I think, giving talks at libraries, or, what could happen to you if you become pregnant? People don't have a clue, and we don't want to scare women to, not get care. That would be even, worse, to not get care, but to make them aware of what risks can happen to pregnant women. And you can die in pregnancy and postpartum if you're not getting the right care. And some of these laws can cause deaths. And one of the worst things we see is when a woman loses her baby to Child Protective Services. We're seeing suicides and overdoses after that. And we think there's a direct correlation between taking your child away and not wanting to go on. So I think we can do a lot more to get the word out, and whether it's book clubs, small groups, telling our story. I will be sharing Joe's link to her film because it's fantastic, and I want everybody to see that.
Yes. So just to piggyback off everything that was just said, also the storytelling part is huge for me, holding the people who are controlling the narrative accountable for the words and the language that they use when they describe people in the news, in the community, wherever, when they're describing people that use drugs as if it's a moral failure, it's automatically criminalized. We have to challenge that and, support independent people who are making their own news and that are alternatively challenging the mainstream narratives that are saying, we understand that this is a problem that people have that is more to do with their brain and less to do with their morality. Not only that, but the art, like we saw over last summer, the murals that went up. When we're talking about causes and things like that, it needs to come out in our art and our expression, and the murals that we make, the songs that we produce, the clothing that we wear, all kinds of things. We can walk around and be a message to people, whether we start a conversation or not, but we can at least plant seeds that put that out there. Also, a part of what was just said is how we don't want to discourage people from getting care. Understand that that's partially why it happens. We have a term called free birth, which for some people is about their autonomy and their sovereignty and their rights to give birth alone without a medical care provider, without anyone there. But if they're making that decision out of desperation and fear to have their baby and to birth at home and to not get prenatal care because they're so terrified of how they're going to be treated and if their baby is going to be taken away, we have to amplify those types of stories when they come out with compassion and with dignity and respect to that person for making that decision because the system failed them.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I'm definitely in agreement with what has been said. And I think as far as collaborations, especially academic and community collaborations, I think creating equitable collaborations, because what you see a lot is sort of these big academic powerhouses pulling the community agencies along so that they're serving their agenda, where I really think that we need to sort of invest in more efforts to amplify the voices of the community and people who have been impacted by policies like this.
Yeah.
And supporting programs in Wisconsin like Wisdom, Sophia, that are criminal justice reform focused. They're on many levels. I think that's one thing that has to change in our state.
Yeah. And just 2 additional tools I'll share with folks. As we mentioned, the Personhood Policing Pregnant Women in America documentary is available to everyone for free through July 14th. So watch it, share it with your friends. And then also next week, Repro Action, which is a great direct action activist organization, is co-hosting an event with the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction about how to talk about these issues to your friends. And so that will be a great event, 3 to 4:30 Central on Tuesday, and you can sign up at the link here as well. I just want to thank everyone so much for being here, and to our panelists for sharing your wisdom with all of us and your time. So thank you.